The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large terminal windows at Atlanta International Airport as Marcus Thompson made his way through the crowded corridors. At 42 years old, with 15 years of experience as a commercial airline pilot, he had walked these same paths countless times before, though usually in his crisp pilot's uniform. Today was different. He wore comfortable jeans, a navy blue sweater, and carried a simple leather backpack. Marcus was heading to Los Angeles to begin his next flight assignment, but today he was traveling as a passenger. After years of dedicated service, he had accumulated enough airline miles to enjoy the comfort of first-class travel. As he approached Gate B7, he checked his boarding pass one more time. Flight 2471, Seat 3A. The gate area was bustling with early morning travelers, business people typing frantically on laptops, families trying to keep their children entertained, and elderly couples sitting quietly with their travel pillows. Marcus found an empty seat near the window and settled in to wait for boarding to begin. Now boarding Flight 2471 to Los Angeles, starting with our first-class passengers, the gate agent announced over the intercom. Marcus gathered his belongings and joined the line, boarding pass and ID in hand. As he approached the gate, he noticed the agent's slight pause when checking his documents, a brief moment of surprise he had grown accustomed to over the years. Still, she smiled professionally and wished him a pleasant flight. Marcus had learned long ago to let such small moments roll off his shoulders. Walking down the jet bridge, Marcus could feel the familiar excitement that came with flying, even as a passenger. The distinct smell of jet fuel and the subtle vibration of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit brought back memories of his first days as a pilot. As he stepped onto the aircraft, he was greeted by Sarah Miller, a flight attendant with perfectly styled blonde hair and a pressed uniform. Her welcoming smile faltered slightly as their eyes met, and her tone shifted from warm to cool. "Your boarding pass, sir?" she asked, despite having just watched him hand it to the gate agent. Marcus calmly showed her his documentation again. "Seat 3A, he said pleasantly, maintaining his professional demeanor. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a hint of doubt that was impossible to miss. Several nearby passengers looked up from their phones and tablets, watching the interaction. "Yes, I'm quite sure," Marcus replied, his voice steady and confident. He had encountered similar situations before and knew better than to let it affect him. With dignified patience, he showed her his boarding pass once more. Sarah scrutinized the document longer than necessary before reluctantly stepping aside. "Very well. Seat 3A is by the window, that way," she said, pointing with noticeably less enthusiasm than she had shown to previous passengers. Marcus made his way to his seat, placing his backpack in the overhead compartment. As he settled into the comfortable leather chair, he could hear Sarah's voice return to its cheerful tone as she greeted the passengers behind him. A middle-aged businessman in a well-tailored suit took the seat next to Marcus. The man gave him a brief nod before becoming engrossed in his phone. Through the window, Marcus watched the ground crew complete their pre-flight checks, a process he had supervised countless times from the cockpit. As the cabin filled with passengers, Sarah began her first-class beverage service. She moved from row to row, offering drinks with practiced efficiency and warm smiles. When she reached Marcus's row, her demeanor changed noticeably. "What would you like?" she asked curtly, without making eye contact. "Coffee, black, please," Marcus responded politely. Sarah placed a napkin on his tray table with considerably less care than she had shown other passengers and poured his coffee without a word. Some of the liquid sloshed over the cup's rim, but she had already moved on to the next row before Marcus could mention it. As Marcus dabbed at the spilled coffee with his napkin, he glanced at his watch. It would be a 5-hour flight to Los Angeles, and he could already tell it was going to be an interesting journey. Little did anyone know, including Sarah, that the events about to unfold would change perspectives and challenge prejudices in ways none of them could have anticipated. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their departure, and Marcus leaned back in his seat, taking a sip of his coffee. After all his years in aviation, he knew that every flight had its own story. This one, however, was about to become more memorable than most. As Flight 2471 reached its cruising altitude, Sarah's discriminatory behavior toward Marcus became increasingly obvious to the surrounding passengers. During the meal service, while other first-class travelers were given detailed descriptions of their dining options, Marcus received only curt, minimal responses. Chicken or pasta? Sarah stated flatly when she reached his row, not even forming it as a question. Her eyes remained fixed on her service cart rather than meeting his gaze. Could you tell me what comes with the chicken? Marcus asked politely, maintaining his composure. Sarah sighed audibly. It's just chicken. Do you want it or not? Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats at her tone. The chicken will be fine, thank you, Marcus replied, noticing how she carefully explained the full menu to the businessman sitting next to him just moments later. When the meals were served, Marcus noticed his portion appeared significantly smaller than others, and his side dishes were barely warm. The businessman next to him received a hot, well-presented plate with a garnish that was noticeably absent from Marcus's meal. Throughout the meal service, Sarah made several passing comments within earshot of Marcus. Some people just don't know their place, she muttered to another flight attendant while walking past his seat. First class isn't what it used to be, she said loud enough for several passengers to hear. An elderly woman across the aisle looked at Marcus sympathetically. She had witnessed the entire interaction and seemed troubled by Sarah's behavior. After a few moments of internal debate, she pressed her call button. When Sarah arrived, the woman spoke up. Excuse me, but I couldn't help noticing the different treatment you're giving to this gentleman, she said, gesturing toward Marcus. It's quite unprofessional. Sarah's face flushed red. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, she replied stiffly. I treat all passengers exactly the same. That's simply not true, the woman persisted. I've been watching, and your behavior is completely unacceptable. Other passengers began to nod in agreement, and a low murmur of conversation spread through the first-class cabin. Sarah's face grew even redder, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down on her behavior. Turning to Marcus, she said loudly, Sir, if you're uncomfortable with the service in first class, we can always find you a seat in economy. Her emphasis on the word economy made her implications clear. Marcus took a deep breath before responding. I'm quite comfortable where I am, thank you. I've earned this seat through years of loyalty to the airline. His voice remained calm and professional, a skill he developed over years of handling challenging situations in the cockpit. Earned it? Sarah scoffed. I find that hard to believe. Her words hung in the air, heavy with prejudice. The businessman next to Marcus, who had been silently observing the situation, finally spoke up. Excuse me, but this is completely inappropriate. I'd like to speak to your supervisor. Sarah's expression flickered between anger and concern. The lead flight attendant is currently in the economy cabin, she said defensively. I'm sure this is all just a misunderstanding. Just then, another flight attendant, Jessica, who had overheard the commotion, approached the group. She was younger than Sarah and appeared visibly uncomfortable with the situation. Sarah, they need you in the galley, Jessica said, clearly trying to diffuse the tension. Sarah stepped away, but not before giving Marcus one final disapproving glance. As Jessica began clearing the meal trays, she quietly apologized to Marcus. I'm so sorry about this, sir. This isn't what our airline stands for. Marcus nodded appreciatively at her words. Thank you, but you don't need to apologize for someone else's behavior. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Many were typing on their phones, likely documenting the incident on social media or preparing complaints to the airline. Marcus pulled out his book, attempting to focus on reading rather than the uncomfortable atmosphere around him. With several hours still remaining in the flight, he hoped the situation wouldn't escalate further. However, fate had other plans for Flight 2471, and Sarah's true awakening to her prejudices was about to come in a way none of them could have predicted. As the flight continued over the Midwest, the tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker with each passing hour. Sarah had taken to loudly discussing passenger standards with another flight attendant near the galley, her voice clearly intended to carry to where Marcus sat. Back in my day, she said, not bothering to lower her voice, there were certain expectations about who belonged in first class. Now they just let anyone with points upgrade. She punctuated her words with a meaningful glance in Marcus's direction. Marcus remained focused on his book, though the words on the page had become a blur. In his 15 years as a pilot, he had encountered prejudice before, but rarely so blatant and persistent. His mind wandered to the countless flights he had captained, wondering if any of his crew members had harbored similar biases without his knowledge. The situation escalated when Marcus pressed his call button to request a glass of water. Several minutes passed without any response. When he pressed it again, Sarah marched over with visible irritation. "Yes," she asked sharply, reaching up to turn off the call light without waiting for his response. "Could I please have some water?" Marcus asked calmly. Sarah's lips tightened. "We're trying to minimize service trips right now. You'll have to wait until the next scheduled beverage service." The businessman next to Marcus, who had just received his requested coffee moments earlier, raised his eyebrows. "That's strange," he commented. "You didn't seem to have any problem bringing my drink." Sarah ignored him completely. As she turned to leave, her elbow knocked Marcus's book from his armrest onto the floor. She didn't pause or apologize, continuing down the aisle as if nothing had happened. Jessica, the younger flight attendant who had shown kindness earlier, noticed the incident and quickly came over to retrieve the book. "I'm so sorry about that, sir," she whispered, handing it back to Marcus. She placed a bottle of water on his tray table with an apologetic smile. Sarah noticed this interaction from the galley and called out, "Jessica, I need your help with something." Her tone made it clear that the something was more about preventing Jessica from showing Marcus any courtesy than actual assistance. The elderly woman across the aisle, who had spoken up earlier, was now on her phone, apparently sending emails. "I'm documenting everything," she told Marcus. "This kind of behavior has no place in modern society, let alone on a professional airline." As the flight progressed past the halfway point, dark clouds began gathering outside the windows. The captain announced they were heading into some turbulence and requested that all passengers remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. During this announcement, Sarah was doing the cabin check. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused and said loudly, "Sir, your seatbelt needs to be tighter. We wouldn't want any accidents." The way she emphasized the word accidents made several passengers look up in shock. The implication in her tone was impossible to miss. Marcus calmly adjusted his seatbelt, though it had already been properly fastened. As a pilot, he knew exactly how to secure himself during turbulence. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. The plane began to encounter rougher air, causing moderate turbulence. As the aircraft shuddered, Sarah used the movement as an excuse to stumble slightly, causing her to bump Marcus's shoulder roughly as she passed. "Oh, my apologies," she said, her voice dripping with insincerity. "The turbulence, you understand." The businessman next to Marcus had finally had enough. "This is ridiculous," he said, pulling out his phone. "I'm recording all of this. The airline's corporate office will be hearing about it." Sarah's face showed a flicker of concern for the first time, but she quickly masked it with her previous disdain. "Record all you want," she said. "I'm just doing my job." Little did Sarah know that in just a few minutes, her entire perspective would be forced to change. As the turbulence increased and the sky outside grew darker, none of the passengers or crew realized that they were about to face a situation where prejudices would become meaningless in the face of a much greater challenge. The captain's voice was about to come over the intercom again, but this time, the announcement would change everything. The aircraft shuddered as it pushed through another patch of turbulence. Outside the windows, dark clouds had transformed the sunny day into an ominous gray landscape. Suddenly, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, but something was different about his tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, his voice strained. "This is Captain Mitchell speaking. We're experiencing some difficulties in the cockpit." There was a long pause that made passengers exchange worried glances. "Please remain calm and seated with your seatbelts fastened." The announcement ended abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in the cabin. Moments later, Jessica rushed past Marcus's seat toward the cockpit, her face pale with concern. Through the first-class curtain, passengers could see other flight attendants hurriedly conferring with each other. Sarah appeared from the galley, attempting to maintain her professional demeanor despite the obvious tension. For the first time since takeoff, her focus wasn't on making Marcus uncomfortable. Something more serious was clearly happening. A sudden violent shake of turbulence sent Sarah stumbling into a nearby seat. The fastened seatbelt sign chimed repeatedly as the plane hit another rough patch of air. Then came a second announcement, this time from the first officer. If there is any medical doctor on board, please identify yourself to a flight attendant immediately. Also, he hesitated. If there are any commercial airline pilots among the passengers, we request your assistance in the cockpit. Murmurs of concern rippled through the cabin. A middle-aged woman in business class raised her hand, identifying herself as a nurse. Sarah quickly escorted her to the front of the plane. The businessman next to Marcus leaned over. A medical emergency in the cockpit. That's not good. I hope there's a pilot on board. Marcus remained quiet, weighing his options. Despite the treatment he'd received, his professional instincts were kicking in. He knew that if the captain was experiencing a medical emergency, the first officer would need support, especially given the deteriorating weather conditions. Jessica returned to the first-class cabin, her face even more worried than before. "Is there anyone here with flight experience?" she asked, looking around desperately. "Anyone at all?" The turbulence increased, causing the plane to drop suddenly. Several passengers gasped, and a child in business class began crying. Through the windows, flashes of lightning illuminated the dark clouds surrounding them. Sarah returned to the cabin, her earlier arrogance replaced by visible fear. "The captain is having severe chest pains," she announced to her fellow flight attendants, not realizing her voice carried to the nearby passengers. "The nurse says it might be a heart attack." The plane shuddered again, and the lights flickered briefly. The no smoking sign above them rattled with each new bump of turbulence. Outside, the weather was getting worse. "We need to divert," Sarah said to Jessica, "but the first officer says the nearest airport is experiencing severe weather. He's not sure he can handle this alone." Marcus could hear the rising panic in her voice. As a pilot, he knew exactly what the first officer was facing: a medical emergency, deteriorating weather conditions, and the responsibility for over 200 passengers' lives. The businessman turned to Marcus again. "Where's the nearest airport? Do you think we'll make it?" Before Marcus could respond, a violent shake rocked the aircraft. Overhead bines rattled, and a few passengers screamed. The sound of the engines changed pitch, indicating the plane was trying to climb above the turbulence. Jessica made another pass through the cabin, her voice now urgent. "Please, if anyone has any flying experience at all, we need help in the cockpit immediately." Sarah stood in the galley, gripping the wall for support, her face having lost all trace of its earlier condescension. The gravity of the situation had stripped away her prejudices, replacing them with raw fear. Marcus looked out the window at the storm clouds surrounding them. He could feel the aircraft struggling against the weather, could sense the first officer's challenges in the cockpit. As a pilot, he knew exactly what needed to be done. As a human being, he knew what was right. The plane dropped again, causing several drinks to spill and more passengers to cry out in fear. The moment had come for Marcus to make his decision, one that would force Sarah to confront her prejudices in the most unexpected way. Another violent shake rattled through the aircraft, and Marcus knew he couldn't wait any longer. Rising from his seat with practiced steadiness despite the turbulence, he pressed his call button. Sarah rushed over, all traces of her previous attitude replaced by panic. "Sir, please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened," she began automatically. "I can help," Marcus said calmly, reaching into his back pocket. "I'm a commercial airline pilot." Sarah's face froze as Marcus pulled out his airline ID and captain's credentials. Her eyes widened as she read. "Captain Marcus Thompson, Senior Flight Officer, 15 years of service." But, she stammered, her face draining of color as the realization of her earlier behavior sank in. "We can discuss this later," Marcus said firmly. "Right now, I need to get to the cockpit. The first officer needs assistance." Jessica, who had overheard the exchange, rushed over. "You're a captain?" she asked, relief flooding her face. "Thank goodness. Follow me, please." As Marcus moved toward the cockpit, other passengers began to understand what was happening. The elderly woman who had defended him earlier smiled proudly, while the businessman who witnessed Sarah's treatment shook his head in disbelief. Sarah stood frozen in the galley, watching as Marcus followed Jessica to the front of the plane. Her hands trembled as she remembered every discriminatory comment, every snide remark, every act of poor service she had directed at the very person who might now save their lives. The cockpit door opened, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. The first officer, young and clearly stressed, was handling the controls while trying to monitor the captain, who was slumped in his seat, being attended to by the nurse. Captain Thompson, Marcus introduced himself, showing his credentials to the first officer. "What's our situation?" The relief on the first officer's face was immediate. "Thank God you're here, sir. Captain Mitchell started experiencing severe chest pains about 10 minutes ago. We're trying to divert to Kansas City, but the weather's terrible, and I'm having trouble maintaining our optimal altitude with these wind conditions." Marcus quickly assessed the situation, checking the instruments and weather radar. The nurse looked up from attending to Captain Mitchell. "His symptoms are consistent with a heart attack. He needs immediate medical attention." Nodding, Marcus took the co-pilot's seat as the first officer shifted to make room. "I'll take control of the aircraft. You focus on the radio communications and diversion plans." "Yes, sir," the first officer replied gratefully. From the cabin, Sarah watched through the slightly open cockpit door as Marcus smoothly took command of the situation. His hands moved across the controls with confident familiarity, his voice steady as he discussed options with the first officer. The other passengers had noticed the change in the plane's movement. It was now handling the turbulence with more stability, the previous erratic motion smoothing out under Marcus's experienced control. Jessica approached Sarah, who was still standing in shock. "Can you believe it?" Jessica whispered. "All this time, you were treating a senior captain like that." Sarah couldn't respond. She watched as Marcus calmly directed the first officer, his expertise evident in every word and action. The same man she had humiliated, dismissed, and discriminated against was now the one person standing between them and disaster. Through the cockpit door, they could hear Marcus's clear, confident voice. "Kansas City approach. This is Flight 2471, declaring a medical emergency. Requesting priority landing clearance." The businessman who had witnessed everything turned to the elderly woman across the aisle. "Well," he said, loud enough for Sarah to hear, "I guess this shows you can never judge a book by its cover." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as the full weight of her prejudice crashed down on her. But there was no time for her personal crisis. They still had to land the plane safely, and Captain Mitchell needed urgent medical care. The aircraft banked smoothly to the left, beginning its descent toward Kansas City. In the cockpit, Marcus was focused entirely on the task at hand, his earlier mistreatment set aside in favor of doing what he did best, being a pilot when people needed him most. As Flight 2471 descended through the stormy skies toward Kansas City International Airport, Marcus's expertise became increasingly evident. His hands moved smoothly over the controls, making constant adjustments to keep the aircraft stable in the turbulent conditions. "First Officer Reynolds," Marcus said calmly, "please contact ground operations and ensure we have medical personnel standing by at Gate C-15. Captain Mitchell's condition is our priority." The first officer nodded, impressed by how Marcus could manage both the technical aspects of flying and the human emergency simultaneously. In the captain's seat, the nurse continued monitoring Captain Mitchell's vital signs while providing updates. Back in the cabin, the passengers had settled into an uneasy calm, their confidence boosted by the noticeable improvement in the plane's handling. Sarah stood in the galley, her earlier arrogance replaced by shame as she watched Marcus work through the cockpit door. Approaching 10,000 feet, Marcus announced clearly, "First Officer, please begin final approach checklist." The storm outside intensified, with lightning illuminating the dark clouds around them. Rain pelted the windshield as Marcus guided the aircraft through the weather system, his movements precise and assured. Jessica approached Sarah with a stack of landing preparation cards. "We need to secure the cabin," she said gently, seeing her colleague's distress. "Sarah, are you okay to handle the rear section?" Sarah straightened her uniform, trying to regain her professional composure. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can do it." As she moved through the cabin, she could hear passengers discussing the situation. "Did you see how that flight attendant treated him earlier?" one whispered. "And now he's saving all our lives," another responded. Through the intercom, Marcus's voice came through, steady and reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Thompson speaking from the flight deck. We're beginning our final approach into Kansas City International Airport. The weather is challenging, but we have everything under control. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened." The contrast between his professional tone and Sarah's earlier treatment of him made several passengers shake their heads in disbelief. The businessman who had witnessed everything turned to his seatmate and said, "Now that's what you call grace under pressure." In the cockpit, Marcus focused on the approach, his years of experience evident in every decision. He coordinated with air traffic control, managed the aircraft systems, and kept an eye on Captain Mitchell's condition, all while navigating through severe weather. Kansas City approach, Flight 2471 Heavy, established on ILS runway 19R. Marcus communicated, his voice clear and professional. The first officer watched in admiration as Marcus handled the difficult approach with remarkable skill. Despite the gusty crosswinds and poor visibility, the aircraft remained stable and on course. Sarah completed her cabin checks and returned to the forward galley, where she could hear Marcus working with the tower to ensure everything was ready for their emergency landing. His calm professionalism made her previous behavior seem even more shameful. 500 feet came the automated callout. Marcus adjusted for a strong crosswind, keeping the aircraft perfectly aligned with the runway. The passengers could feel the difference in how the plane was being handled: smooth, controlled, confident. Even through the storm, Marcus's expertise showed in every movement of the aircraft. 200 feet, the computer announced. Through the rain-streaked windshield, the runway lights began to appear. Sarah gripped the galley counter, tears in her eyes as she listened to Marcus, professionally coordinating with ground control to ensure medical teams would be in position the moment they landed. First Officer Reynolds, Marcus said, "Please inform the cabin crew to prepare for landing." Jessica made the announcement, her voice steady. "Cabin crew, seats for landing." As they made their final approach, Marcus demonstrated the skill and composure that had earned him his position as a senior captain. The same man Sarah had deemed unworthy of sitting in first class was now executing a perfect landing in severe weather conditions while managing a medical emergency. The irony was lost on no one, least of all Sarah, who whispered to herself, "I am so sorry," as she watched Marcus guide the aircraft toward the runway with unwavering precision. The runway lights grew clearer through the rain, and Marcus prepared for what would be one of the most challenging landings of his career, all while maintaining the professional grace that Sarah had failed to show him just hours earlier. 50 feet, the automated system announced as Marcus guided Flight 2471 through the final moments of its approach. Rain lashed against the windshield, but his focus remained absolute. The runway lights pierced through the storm, guiding their path. 40, 30, 20. The automated voice continued its countdown as Marcus made minute adjustments to account for the crosswind. First Officer Reynolds watched in amazement as the experienced captain handled the challenging conditions with remarkable precision. 10. 5. The massive aircraft floated just above the wet runway. With expert timing, Marcus executed a perfect touchdown, so smooth that many passengers didn't realize they had landed until they felt the gentle deceleration. Kansas City Tower, Flight 2471 on the ground. Marcus reported calmly, engaging the thrust reversers and applying appropriate braking for the wet conditions. Despite the emergency situation, his voice remained steady and professional. As they taxied toward Gate C-15, emergency vehicles with flashing lights were already visible through the rain. Marcus efficiently coordinated with ground control while First Officer Reynolds worked with the medical team through a separate radio channel. The moment the aircraft came to a stop at the gate, medical personnel rushed aboard. Sarah quickly opened the cabin door, her hands trembling slightly as she watched the paramedics hurry toward the cockpit. Captain Mitchell was carefully transferred to a stretcher, the nurse who had helped during the flight providing the paramedics with vital information about his condition. As they wheeled him past the first-class cabin, several passengers watched with concern. Marcus completed the shutdown checklist with First Officer Reynolds, ensuring all aircraft systems were properly secured despite the rushed circumstances. Only then did he stand up from the controls, his calm demeanor maintained even after the crisis had passed. As the passengers began to realize the full scope of what had happened, spontaneous applause broke out in the cabin. The elderly woman who had defended Marcus earlier wiped tears from her eyes as she clapped. The businessman who had witnessed Sarah's earlier behavior stood up to join the ovation. Jessica made an announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until we've received clearance for deplaning. We thank you for your patience during this emergency situation. and we're especially grateful to Captain Thompson for his assistance today." The applause grew louder at the mention of Marcus's name. Several passengers pulled out their phones, recording the moment and already beginning to share their experience on social media. Sarah stood near the galley, her face flushed with shame as she watched Marcus emerge from the cockpit. He showed no sign of triumph or satisfaction, only professional concern as he spoke with the gate agent about arrangements for the passengers' onward connections. The airline's local management team had arrived at the gate, having been notified of the emergency. They approached Marcus with obvious respect, thanking him for his intervention and requesting his assistance with the incident reports. Of course, Marcus replied professionally, "Though our first priority should be ensuring the passengers are taken care of and receiving updates on Captain Mitchell's condition." As the passengers finally began to deplane, many stopped to shake Marcus's hand or thank him personally. The businessman who had sat next to him paused to say, "Sir, I've never seen anything like that. You handled both the emergency and the earlier situation with incredible grace." The elderly woman who had spoken up in Marcus's defense approached him with tears in her eyes. "Young man," she said, squeezing his hand, "you showed us all what true professionalism looks like today." Sarah stood by the door, performing her required farewell duties, though she could barely meet the eyes of departing passengers. Many gave her disapproving looks as they passed, the contrast between her earlier behavior and Marcus's life-saving intervention still fresh in their minds. As the last passengers deplaned, Marcus gathered his belongings from his original seat in first class. The same seat Sarah had questioned his right to occupy just hours earlier now seemed to stand as a symbol of the day's lessons about prejudice and judgment. First Officer Reynolds approached Marcus one final time. "Captain Thompson," he said earnestly, "I can't thank you enough. The way you handled everything today, it was truly remarkable." Marcus simply nodded, maintaining his professional demeanor until the very end. As he prepared to leave the aircraft, the story of Flight 2471 was already spreading through the airport and across social media, though its impact on one flight attendant's perspective would prove to be the most profound change of all. In the days following the dramatic landing of Flight 2471, the story spread rapidly across social media and news outlets. Videos taken by passengers showed both Sarah's discriminatory behavior and Marcus's heroic intervention, creating a powerful narrative about prejudice and professionalism. The airline's corporate office acted swiftly. By the following morning, they had launched a thorough investigation into the incident. Sarah was immediately placed on administrative leave pending review. Several passengers had submitted formal complaints, accompanied by video evidence of her conduct. Captain Mitchell made a full recovery in the hospital, having received the urgent medical care he needed thanks to Marcus's timely assistance. He personally reached out to Marcus to express his gratitude, acknowledging that the outcome could have been much worse without another experienced pilot on board. A week after the incident, Sarah sat nervously in the airline's human resources office. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and she expected to be terminated. Instead, she was surprised when the HR director presented her with an alternative. "We believe in learning from our mistakes," the director explained. "Instead of termination, we're offering you a chance to be part of the solution. We're developing a new anti-discrimination training program, and your experience could help others understand the real-world consequences of prejudice." Sarah, still deeply affected by the events, accepted immediately. The shame of her actions had transformed into a genuine desire for change. She requested permission to apologize to Marcus in person. The meeting was arranged in the airline's corporate office. When Marcus entered the room, Sarah struggled to maintain her composure. "Captain Thompson," she began, her voice trembling, "I am so deeply sorry for how I treated you. My behavior was inexcusable." Marcus listened quietly as she continued. "You showed me what true professionalism looks like. Despite how I treated you, you didn't hesitate to help when we needed you. I'll never forget that lesson." "Thank you for your apology," Marcus replied thoughtfully. "But this isn't just about me. It's about recognizing that expertise, professionalism, and character have nothing to do with someone's appearance or background." The airline implemented comprehensive changes following the incident. They enhanced their diversity training programs, using the Flight 2471 incident as a case study. Sarah, true to her word, became an active participant in these sessions, sharing her story as a powerful example of how unconscious bias can cloud judgment. The story's impact extended beyond the airline industry. Major news networks picked up the narrative, leading to discussions about workplace discrimination and prejudice. Marcus was invited to speak at several conferences, where he shared his experiences with grace and wisdom. The goal isn't to shame people, he would say during these talks, but to help them recognize and overcome their biases. What happened on that flight was a microcosm of a larger social issue. 3 months after the incident, the airline organized a special ceremony. Marcus was honored for his exceptional service, not just for saving Flight 2471, but for his handling of the entire situation. Sarah was invited to attend, now serving as a diversity and inclusion coordinator for the airline's training department. During the ceremony, Sarah shared her perspective. Sometimes it takes a dramatic event to open our eyes. Captain Thompson didn't just save our flight that day, he showed me, and many others, the cost of prejudice and the power of professionalism. The businessman who had witnessed everything wrote a viral LinkedIn post about the experience, concluding with, "In one flight, I saw the worst and best of human nature." Captain Thompson's actions remind us that true excellence knows no color, and real professionalism means rising above prejudice. A year later, the airline's training program, partly shaped by the incident, received an industry award for excellence in promoting diversity and inclusion. Sarah, now fully committed to her new role, often used her own story to help others recognize and address their biases. Marcus continued his career as a pilot, earning additional promotions and accolades. He remained humble about the incident, always emphasizing the larger lessons rather than his personal role. The story of Flight 2471 became more than just an aviation incident. It became a powerful reminder that prejudice can blind people to the capabilities of others, and that true professionalism means treating everyone with respect, regardless of appearance or assumptions. In the end, a potential tragedy had transformed into a lasting lesson about human dignity and the importance of looking beyond superficial judgments.